I remember the exact moment everything shifted, though no one else at that table realized it yet. "You should have made sure I never found this," I said quietly, sliding the thin envelope across the polished oak surface, watching as Sophia's perfectly composed smile faltered for just a second too long. Daniel looked between us, confused at first, then uneasy, like a man who could feel the ground starting to move beneath his feet but didn't yet understand why. The dining room was warm, the kind of early evening light pouring in through the windows that used to make this house feel like a sanctuary, but now it only highlighted how out of place I had become in a life I once built. I sat there calmly, hands folded in my lap, the same way I had sat through countless family dinners over the years, listening more than speaking, observing more than reacting. They thought they knew me. They thought they understood exactly how far they could push, how much they could take, and how quietly I would disappear when they were done. For a long time, I let them believe that. Sophia was the first to recover. She let out a soft laugh, the kind she used when she wanted to smooth over tension without actually addressing it. "I'm not sure what you mean, Margaret," she said, her tone light, almost amused, but I noticed the way her fingers tightened slightly around her wineglass. Daniel shifted in his chair, clearing his throat as if preparing to step in, but he hesitated. That hesitation told me more than any words could. I didn't rush to explain myself. I didn't need to. The weight of that envelope was enough. Weeks earlier, I wouldn't have even imagined sitting here like this, holding something that could unravel the version of reality they had carefully constructed around me. Back then, I was still trying to understand why everything felt just slightly off, like a picture frame hanging crooked on the wall that no one else seemed to notice. It started with small things. Conversations that stopped when I entered the room. Decisions being made without me, then presented as if they had always been inevitable. I told myself it was normal. Families change. Children grow up, build their own lives. Mothers step back. That's what I believed, because it was easier than asking the question that had begun to form quietly in the back of my mind. What if I wasn't stepping back? What if I was being moved out of the way? The night Daniel first mentioned the house, it sounded so casual I almost missed it. "Mom, did you like what we did with the place?" he asked over dinner, cutting into his steak like he was asking about the weather. I remember pausing, my fork hovering in midair. "What place?" I asked. He frowned, just slightly, like I'd forgotten something obvious. And then Sophia stepped in, smiling that polished, practiced smile. "Oh, Daniel, she's joking," she said lightly, her eyes meeting mine for a fraction of a second, something unreadable flickering beneath the surface. That was the moment the first crack appeared. I didn't argue. I didn't press. I simply nodded and let the conversation move on, but something inside me had already begun to shift. I had spent decades building a life rooted in trust, in shared effort, in the belief that family meant something solid and unshakable. But sitting there that night, watching my own son avoid my eyes while his wife answered questions that were never directed at her, I realized something far more unsettling than any single lie. I realized I didn't know what was real anymore. And once that thought takes hold, it doesn't go away. It waits. It watches. And eventually, it leads you straight to the truth, whether anyone wants you to find it or not. 2 weeks before that dinner, my world had already begun to feel smaller, though I could not yet explain why. The house I lived in was modest, a small one-story rental on the edge of town with thin walls and a heater that clicked loudly every time it turned on, but I told myself it was enough. I had learned to live with less. I kept the thermostat at 65 degrees to save on electricity, wore an extra sweater when the evenings grew cold, and stretched every grocery trip as far as I could, carefully comparing prices and putting things back when they felt unnecessary. It was not the life I once had, but it was the life I believed I deserved after everything had changed. After my husband passed, I had told myself that simplicity would bring peace. I did not question it when Daniel visited less often, or when our phone calls became shorter, filled with polite updates instead of real conversation. I told myself he was busy. Successful people are always busy. And Sophia, with her careful words and composed presence, always had a way of explaining things that made everything sound reasonable. She would call occasionally, her voice smooth and reassuring, telling me that they were handling things, that I should not worry about paperwork or finances, that everything was being taken care of. I believed her because it felt easier than imagining anything else. The distance between us grew slowly, so slowly that I almost did not notice it at first. Invitations became fewer. Decisions were made without me. Traditions we once held onto quietly disappeared, replaced by new plans that I only heard about after the fact. I would sit at my small kitchen table in the mornings, a cup of coffee growing cold in my hands, and scroll through photos Daniel posted online. Smiling faces, bright rooms, a life that looked comfortable and full. I felt proud of him. That is what I told myself. That is what a mother is supposed to feel. But sometimes, in the quiet moments, a question would surface before I could push it away. If his life was so full, why did mine feel so empty? I never asked him that. Instead, I focused on what I could control. I kept my routine simple. I paid my bills on time. I folded my clothes neatly and placed them in drawers that were never too full. I lived carefully, as if any sudden movement might disrupt the fragile balance I had created. And yet, there were moments that did not fit. A piece of mail that never arrived, even though I was certain it should have. A bank statement that seemed lighter than expected, though I could not immediately explain why. A conversation where Sophia answered a question I had directed to Daniel, her tone polite but final, as if closing a door I had not realized was even open. I noticed these things, but I did not act on them. Not yet. Because acknowledging them would mean accepting that something was wrong, and I was not ready to do that. It is a strange thing, how the mind protects itself. It offers you softer explanations, gentler interpretations, anything to avoid the sharper truth waiting just beneath the surface. I told myself I was overthinking. I told myself families change, roles shift, and I needed to adjust. But even then, sitting alone in that quiet kitchen with the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence, I could feel it. Something was missing. Something important. And deep down, in a place I could not quite ignore anymore, I knew it had not simply been lost. It had been taken. I began to pay closer attention after that night, though I made sure no one could tell. It was not in my nature to confront things directly, not without understanding them first. Instead, I listened more carefully, watched more closely, and allowed the silence between words to speak louder than anything said out loud. The next time I visited Daniel and Sophia's house, I noticed how different everything felt, though nothing had changed on the surface. The furniture was new, the walls freshly painted in soft neutral tones, and every detail seemed carefully chosen to create an image of comfort and success. Sophia greeted me at the door with her usual warmth, her smile perfectly measured, her voice light and welcoming, but her eyes moved quickly, assessing, calculating, as if she was always one step ahead of a conversation that had not yet begun. Daniel hugged me briefly, his attention already drifting back to his phone before I had even stepped fully inside. I told myself not to read into it, but something about the way he avoided looking directly at me made my chest feel tight. We sat down for dinner, the table set with more care than I had seen in years, yet the atmosphere felt strangely hollow. Sophia led the conversation, guiding it gently but firmly, steering away from anything that might require real answers. Whenever I asked Daniel a question, she responded before he could, her tone polite but decisive, leaving no space for him to add anything of his own. At first, I thought it was habit, the natural rhythm of a marriage where one person speaks more than the other. But then I began to notice the pattern. It was not just that she answered for him. It was that he allowed it. He deferred to her in ways that felt unfamiliar, as if he had quietly stepped back from his own role in his own life. I tested it once, asking him directly about a letter I had been expecting from the bank. He hesitated, just for a moment, before Sophia smiled and said she would look into it for me, her voice calm, reassuring, final. The conversation moved on, but the answer never came. That moment stayed with me longer than it should have. Later that evening, as I stood near the kitchen sink, rinsing my hands, I overheard something I was not meant to hear. Their voices were low, almost careful, but the tension beneath them was impossible to miss. Sophia was speaking quickly, her tone controlled but sharp around the edges, while Daniel responded in short, uncertain phrases. I could not make out every word, but I heard enough. Words like paperwork, timing, and transfer slipped through the quiet, landing in my mind with a weight I could not ignore. When I stepped back into the room, they both went silent instantly, their expressions shifting too quickly to be natural. Sophia smiled again, that same polished smile, and asked if I wanted more tea. I declined, my hands steady even as my thoughts began to race. It was no longer a question of whether something was wrong. It was a question of how long it had been happening, and how much I had already lost without realizing it. That night, I went home and sat at my small kitchen table long after the lights should have been turned off. I stared at the stack of unopened mail, at the neat lines of my checkbook, at the quiet life I had accepted without question. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider a possibility I had been avoiding. What if the life I thought I was living had been carefully arranged for me, piece by piece, until I no longer recognized what had been taken? And if that was true, then the only way forward was not to ask them for answers, but to find them myself. The next morning, I did something I had not done in years. I went through every drawer in my kitchen, not looking for anything specific at first, just letting my hands move through old envelopes, receipts, and folders I had not opened in a long time. At first, everything looked ordinary. Utility bills, grocery receipts, a few handwritten notes I had kept out of habit. But as I continued, a pattern began to emerge, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. There were gaps. Months where I knew something should have arrived, but there was nothing. Statements that felt incomplete, as if pages were missing from a story I had never been allowed to fully read. I sat down slowly, spreading everything out across the table, aligning dates, comparing amounts, tracing the quiet inconsistencies that had once been easy to dismiss. I noticed that certain payments had stopped without explanation. Small deposits that I could not account for had appeared and then disappeared just as quickly. It was not dramatic. It was careful. Almost invisible unless you were looking for it. And until now, I had not been looking. I reached for my phone and opened my banking app, scrolling through transactions with a focus I had not felt in a long time. The numbers told a story, but it was incomplete. There were references to accounts I did not recognize, transfers labeled in ways that felt deliberately vague. I stared at the screen, my reflection faintly visible in the glass, and for the first time, I allowed myself to admit what I had been avoiding. This was not confusion. This was design. I drove to the bank that afternoon, the same branch I had used for years, the one where the teller still greeted me by name. The familiarity of it grounded me, but I did not let it soften my resolve. I asked for a full history of my accounts, every detail, every transaction, every document associated with my name. The young man behind the desk hesitated for a moment, his expression shifting as he pulled up my information. It was subtle, but I saw it. That flicker of uncertainty. "There seems to be some linked accounts here," he said carefully, turning the screen slightly so I could see. I leaned forward, my hands steady despite the tightening in my chest. There it was. An account I had never opened, tied to my name, with transactions that stretched back further than I expected. Transfers moving in and out, consistent, controlled, intentional. I asked for copies of everything. Not summaries. Not explanations. Everything. He nodded, printing page after page, the quiet hum of the machine filling the space between us. When he handed me the stack, it felt heavier than it should have. Not because of the paper, but because of what it represented. I thanked him, my voice calm, and walked out into the afternoon light. The air felt different somehow, sharper, clearer. I sat in my car for a long moment before turning the key, the documents resting on the passenger seat beside me. I did not open them right away. I did not need to. I already knew enough. This was never about one mistake or one misunderstanding. This was something that had been built over time, piece by piece, decision by decision, until it became a reality I had been living without question. And now, for the first time, I was no longer on the outside of it. I was inside the truth, and there was no turning back. That evening, I finally opened the documents. I laid them out across my kitchen table the same way I used to lay out holiday dinners, careful and deliberate, making sure nothing overlapped, nothing was hidden from view. Page by page, I read through everything, not rushing, not skipping ahead, forcing myself to understand each line, each number, each quiet detail that had been operating behind my back for longer than I wanted to admit. The account tied to my name was not an accident. It had been active for over 2 years, with regular transfers moving money in patterns that felt too precise to be coincidence. Small amounts at first, barely noticeable, then larger ones spaced out just enough to avoid drawing attention. I traced the origin of the transfers, following the digital trail until it led somewhere I could no longer ignore. The source accounts were connected to Daniel. Not directly in a way that would raise immediate suspicion, but close enough that the link was undeniable once you knew where to look. My hands did not shake as I turned the pages, but something inside me settled into a kind of stillness I had never felt before. It was not panic. It was clarity. I kept reading. There were references to property taxes, maintenance fees, and something else that made me pause. An address. I read it once, then again, letting the numbers and street names settle into my mind. It was not familiar, and yet there was something about it that felt like it should have been. I reached for my phone and typed it in, watching as the image loaded slowly on the screen. When it did, I felt the air leave my lungs in a quiet, controlled exhale. The house was beautiful. Large windows, a wide front porch, freshly painted siding, the kind of place you imagine when you think of starting over, of building something new. I stared at it for a long time, taking in every detail, every angle, every carefully staged photograph that made it look like a dream. And then I saw the listing history. Sold 2 years ago. Transferred shortly after. Ownership records available through public access. I clicked through, my fingers steady as I navigated the site. And there it was. My name, attached to the initial transfer. Followed by another transaction months later that removed it just as quietly as it had appeared. I sat back in my chair, the phone still in my hand, the documents spread out in front of me like pieces of a puzzle that had finally come together. They had used me. Not just my name, not just my trust, but my entire identity as a stepping stone towards something they wanted. And I had let them, not because I was careless, but because I believed in something they clearly did not. I closed my eyes for a moment, not to escape the truth, but to absorb it fully. When I opened them again, the room looked the same, but I was not. The woman who had accepted silence, who had explained away inconsistencies, who had trusted without question, was gone. In her place was someone who understood exactly what had been done, and more importantly, what still needed to be done. I gathered the documents carefully, stacking them in order, aligning the edges until they formed a single, solid bundle. This was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of something they had not prepared for. Because for the first time, I was no longer reacting to what they had done. I was preparing for what I would do next. The next day, I did not call Daniel, and I did not reach out to Sophia. Instead, I drove to a place I had not visited in over a year, a quiet office building on the other side of town where my husband used to handle matters I never thought I would need to understand on my own. The receptionist looked up as I entered, her expression polite but uncertain until I gave my name. Recognition followed quickly, and within minutes, I was seated in a familiar office that still carried the same calm, orderly atmosphere I remembered. Mr. Harrison had aged slightly, his hair more silver than before, but his eyes were just as sharp. He greeted me warmly, though I could tell by the way his posture shifted that he sensed something was different. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I placed the stack of documents on his desk and asked him to look at them carefully. He adjusted his glasses and began reading, his expression neutral at first, then gradually tightening in ways that confirmed what I already knew. He did not interrupt me, and I did not speak while he worked through each page. The silence in that room was not uncomfortable. It was precise, focused, the kind of silence that allows truth to settle without distraction. When he finally looked up, he did not ask unnecessary questions. He simply leaned back slightly and said, "How long have you known?" I told him the truth. Not long enough. He nodded slowly, as if that answer fit into something he had already been considering. Then he opened a drawer and removed a folder I had never seen before. The paper inside was older, the edges slightly worn, but the contents were clear and deliberate. He placed it in front of me without explanation, allowing me to read it myself. At first, the language felt dense, filled with terms I had once relied on my husband to interpret, but as I continued, the meaning became impossible to ignore. It was an addendum, a legal safeguard written into documents I had not fully understood at the time. A condition. Any transfer of property, any financial movement tied to my name, required my direct authorization and physical confirmation. Not implied. Not assumed. Verified. I read that section twice, then a third time, letting the words settle into something solid and undeniable. Mr. Harrison spoke then, his voice calm but firm. He explained that if what these documents suggested was true, then the actions taken were not just unethical, they were invalid. Every transaction, every transfer, every step built on that foundation could be challenged and reversed. I sat there quietly, absorbing what that meant. It was not relief that I felt. It was something steadier than that. Control. For the first time since this began, the imbalance I had sensed was no longer abstract. It had shape, structure, and most importantly, a weakness. I asked him what needed to be done, and he outlined it clearly. There would be no sudden confrontation, no emotional outburst, no rushed decisions. Everything would be documented, verified, and presented at the right moment, when it could not be dismissed or explained away. I nodded, understanding exactly what that required from me. Patience. Precision. The same qualities they had used against me would now be turned in a different direction. When I left that office, the world outside felt unchanged, but I carried something with me that I had not had before. Not just evidence, but certainty. They believed the story was already written, that the roles were fixed and the outcome decided. But they had overlooked one thing. They had assumed I would never look closely enough to see what they had done. And now that I had, everything they built on that assumption was about to shift. From that point on, I changed nothing on the surface, and that was the most important part of all. I kept my routines exactly the same, waking up at the same time each morning, making my coffee the same way, folding my clothes with the same quiet precision that had defined my life for years. If anyone had been watching me, they would have seen the same woman they had always known, the one who asked for little, expected less, and accepted what she was given without question. That illusion needed to remain intact. A few days later, Sophia called, her voice warm and carefully measured, asking if I would like to come over for dinner. I agreed without hesitation, keeping my tone light, even appreciative, as if nothing had changed. When I arrived, everything felt just as it had before, polished and controlled, every detail arranged to present a certain version of their lives. Daniel greeted me at the door, his smile quick, almost distracted, while Sophia led me inside, already guiding the evening before it had fully begun. Dinner was set beautifully, the kind of effort that suggested care, though I had learned to recognize it as something else entirely. I took my seat and listened as they spoke, allowing their words to move around me without interruption. They talked about renovations, future plans, possibilities that extended far beyond anything they had ever shared with me before. Sophia mentioned the property again, this time more openly, describing upgrades, investments, and long-term value in a way that felt rehearsed. Daniel nodded along, adding small details, but never taking full ownership of the conversation. I watched them both carefully, not searching for guilt, but for consistency. It was there, in the rhythm of their speech, the way certain phrases repeated, the way they avoided specifics when it mattered most. At one point, Sophia turned to me with a smile and said, "We just want what is best for everyone." I met her gaze and returned the smile, gentle and calm, as if I believed every word. "Of course you do," I replied. And in that moment, I realized something that gave me an unexpected sense of clarity. They were not watching me anymore. Not closely. They had already decided who I was in this story, already written my reactions, my limitations, my silence. That assumption gave me space. After dinner, I offered to help clear the table, moving through the kitchen with quiet familiarity, noting small details without appearing to. Documents stacked neatly on the counter, a folder partially tucked beneath a magazine, mail addressed to both of them with markings that matched what I had seen at the bank. I did not touch anything I did not need to, but I saw enough. More than enough. When I left that night, Sophia walked me to the door, her hand resting lightly on my arm, her voice soft as she reminded me to call if I needed anything. I nodded, thanking her, playing the role she expected without hesitation. But as I stepped outside and the door closed behind me, the air felt different again, clearer, sharper, like the moment before a storm finally breaks. I walked to my car slowly, not because I was unsure, but because I understood now that timing mattered more than anything else. Everything I needed was already in motion. All that remained was to let them believe it was not. The following week unfolded exactly as I expected, and that was how I knew I had read everything correctly. There were no sudden changes, no signs of hesitation or concern from either of them. If anything, they seemed more confident, more open in the way they spoke about their plans, as if the future they had built was already secured beyond question. Sophia called again, this time inviting me over for what she described as a small family dinner, something relaxed, nothing formal. I agreed, keeping my voice steady, even warm, as though I was grateful to be included. When I arrived, the atmosphere felt slightly different, not tense but purposeful. The table was set with more care than usual, the lighting softer, the kind of setting designed to make conversations feel important without saying so directly. Daniel greeted me with a longer embrace than before, his tone almost rehearsed in its warmth, while Sophia guided me inside with the same composed ease she always maintained. As we sat down, the conversation began lightly, drifting through familiar topics before gradually narrowing into something more focused. I could feel the shift before it fully happened, the way both of them seemed to align without needing to look at each other. Sophia spoke first, her tone gentle but deliberate, explaining that they had been thinking about the future, about stability, about making decisions that would benefit everyone in the long term. Daniel added to it, his words slower, less certain, but still following the path she had set. They spoke about the property again, more directly. This time, discussing refinancing, expansion, and opportunities that required clarity in ownership. I listened without interrupting, allowing them to present everything exactly as they had planned. There was no accusation in their voices, no acknowledgement of anything hidden, only a carefully constructed narrative that positioned their actions as practical, even generous. At one point, Sophia reached across the table slightly, her expression softening as she said, "We just want to make sure everything is in the right place moving forward." I nodded, meeting her gaze with calm understanding, as if I saw no reason to question what she was saying. "That makes sense," I replied quietly. And in that moment, I saw it. The relief. Subtle, but unmistakable. They believed I was agreeing. They believed the conversation had gone exactly as they needed it to. Dinner continued after that, lighter, almost celebratory in tone, as if a decision had already been made and accepted. I participated just enough to maintain the illusion, asking small questions, offering quiet responses, never pushing too far in any direction. When the meal ended, Daniel mentioned that there might be some paperwork to review soon, nothing complicated, just formalities to ensure everything was aligned. I smiled and told him I trusted him. The words came easily, and that was what made them effective. Because trust, when used at the right moment, can be the most convincing disguise of all. As I left that night, I carried nothing with me except the certainty that everything was now in place. They had revealed their intentions fully, without realizing it. They had given me the timing, the setting, and the confidence I needed to move forward without hesitation. And as I stepped into the quiet darkness outside, I understood something with complete clarity. They thought this next step would secure their future. They had no idea it was the moment that would undo it. The meeting was set for the following Friday, just as Daniel had mentioned, presented as nothing more than a routine step to finalize what they had already framed as a practical decision. The office was bright and orderly, the kind of place designed to make everything feel official, unquestionable, permanent. Daniel arrived first, his posture confident in a way I had not seen in years, while Sophia followed with that same composed expression, her movements precise, controlled, as if she had already rehearsed every moment of what was about to happen. I entered quietly, greeting them both with a calm smile, taking my seat without hesitation. They spoke first, explaining the documents, the need for alignment, the benefits of ensuring everything was clearly structured moving forward. Their words flowed smoothly, almost effortlessly, as if this conversation had already taken place many times in private. I listened, nodding occasionally, allowing them to finish without interruption. When the papers were placed in front of me, I glanced down briefly, not to read, but to acknowledge them, to let the moment settle exactly as they expected it to. Daniel leaned slightly forward, his voice softening as he said, "It is just a formality, Mom. It makes everything easier for everyone." Sophia added a gentle reassurance, her tone warm, encouraging, as if guiding me toward a decision she believed was already made. I placed my hands lightly on the table, my expression steady, my breathing even. For a moment, I said nothing. Silence, I had learned, reveals more than words ever could. I saw it then, the subtle exchange between them, the brief flicker of anticipation, the certainty that I would sign, that I would follow the role they had assigned me without question. That was when I reached into my bag and removed the envelope I had prepared days earlier. I placed it on the table with the same calm precision I had carried through every step of this process. Before we move forward, I said quietly, "There is something you should read." Sophia's smile did not disappear immediately, but it changed, just slightly, the edges tightening as uncertainty began to replace confidence. Daniel frowned, his attention shifting from the papers in front of me to the envelope between us. I did not rush them. I simply waited. When Daniel opened it, his movements were slower than before, his confidence giving way to something more cautious. He read the first page, then the second, his expression shifting in a way that no words could fully capture. Sophia leaned closer, her composure holding for a moment longer before she took the documents from his hands, scanning them quickly, then again more carefully, as if the meaning might change if she looked at it differently. It did not. The room felt quieter then, not because anything had changed externally, but because the certainty they had built their plan on had just been removed. "This does not make sense," Sophia said finally, her voice controlled but thinner than before. I met her gaze, my own expression unchanged. "It does," I replied. "You just were not expecting it." Daniel looked at me then, truly looked, as if seeing me clearly for the first time in a long while. I did not raise my voice. I did not explain more than necessary. The documents spoke for themselves. The conditions, the requirements, the invalid transfers, all laid out with clarity that could not be dismissed or reinterpreted. Everything they had built depended on an assumption that I would never question, never verify, never act. That assumption was gone. I gathered my bag slowly, standing with the same quiet composure I had maintained from the beginning. "I think we are done here," I said, my tone neither harsh nor forgiving, simply final. And as I walked out of that office, leaving behind the version of the story they had written, I understood something with absolute certainty. They had taken what they believed was mine to give. But what they never realized was that it had never truly been theirs to keep.